They told me the station was 320 miles from the nearest paved road, and I remember thinking that sounded like a number someone made up to discourage me. It wasn't. I counted the hours on the flight in. I watched the trees stop. I watched the ground go from green to gray to white, and then to something that wasn't really a color anymore, just a kind of absence with texture. The man flying the supply plane didn't talk much. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of the same weather he flew through. When we landed on the strip outside the station, he didn't shut off the engines. He pointed at my duffel bag, then at the door, and that was the whole conversation. I was on the ice for maybe 90 seconds before he was airborne again. I watched him disappear into the low ceiling, and then I was alone with the wind, and the wind was already louder than anything I had ever stood inside before. The station itself didn't look the way I had imagined. I had pictured something like a research base from a documentary, sleek, white, important. What I actually saw was a low cluster of prefabricated buildings sunk into the snow like they were trying to hide. 3 modules connected by enclosed walkways. A communications mast that hummed even when there was no wind. A fuel depot covered in a tarp that had frozen into the shape of whatever was underneath it. A radar dome on a slight rise that turned slowly, like it was thinking. A man came out of the main module. He was older than I expected, maybe 60, with a beard that had gone white in patches and a parka that had been patched in so many places it was more patched than parka. He didn't shake my hand. He took my bag, looked at me for about 2 seconds and said, "You're the new one." I said yes. He said, "Come inside before your face stops working." That was Havas. He was the station manager, although nobody ever called him that. He was just Havas. There were 6 of us on the station that first month. Havers, who ran things. Petrick, the radio tech, who barely spoke and who I sometimes thought might be deaf in one ear, though I never confirmed it. Lisbeth, who did the equipment maintenance, and who was the only person at the station who ever laughed, though her laughs always came at moments that didn't seem funny. Ardo, the senior meteorologist, who had been there longer than anyone except Havers. And Cohen, who was about my age, who had arrived 8 months before me, and who, on my first night, told me 3 things I should remember. 1. Don't go outside during a storm, even if you hear someone calling you. 2. If the radio gives you a code you don't recognize, write it down and give it to Havas. Don't try to interpret it. 3. If a storm doesn't get a name, don't ask why. I laughed when he said the third one. He didn't. The work, for the first few weeks, was exactly what I had been trained for. I logged surface temperatures every 2 hours. I read barometric pressure from 3 different instruments, and cross-referenced them. I tracked wind speed and direction. I watched the radar. I sent reports up the chain on a schedule that was so rigid it felt almost religious. The reports went to a regional office in Fairbanks, and from there, I assumed, somewhere further. I never thought too much about where. The reports went out. The reports were received. That was the loop. The station ran on a generator that I could hear from every room. After a while, I stopped hearing it consciously, but I would notice immediately if it changed pitch. Everyone there had the same instinct. The first time the generator hiccuped during a meal, all 5 of the others stopped chewing at exactly the same moment. Then it steadied, and they went back to eating, and nobody said anything about it. The fluorescent lights in the main module buzzed at a frequency that I think was slightly off from standard. I noticed it during my second week. I asked Lisbeth about it, and she said the ballasts were old and the cold did things to them, and I accepted that, because it was a reasonable answer. But there were nights when I sat in the control room with only those lights and the soft green wash of the radar, and the buzzing seemed to come from inside my own skull, and I would find myself listening to it the way you might listen to a stranger breathing in a dark room. The dark itself was its own thing. I had been told about polar night. I had read about it. I thought I understood it. I didn't. There is a difference between knowing the sun won't rise and actually living inside that fact. By the 3rd week, I had lost any natural sense of time. I slept when I was tired and woke when I wasn't, and the only thing that anchored the day was the schedule of the reports. 800 hours, 1100, 1400, 1700, 2000, 2300. Numbers in a logbook, in a building, in the dark. I want to describe the cold, but I don't think I can do it accurately. It wasn't a sensation. It was a presence. It pressed against the windows. It came in through the seals around the doors and pulled on the floor of the entryway. When you went outside, even for a minute, it didn't feel like temperature. It felt like the air was actively trying to remove something from you, and you could feel it taking that something, whatever it was, and you came back inside lighter in a way you didn't want to be. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I almost missed it. I was filing the weekly summary, which involved cross-checking my logs against the regional bulletin. The bulletin came in by teletype, on a machine that looked like it belonged in a museum but ran without complaint. It listed every named storm system in our sector for the week, with intensity ratings and tracking data. That week, I had personally logged 3 significant storm events. The bulletin listed 2. I assumed I had made a mistake. I went back through my notes. The 3rd storm was there. I had logged it for almost 11 hours, from initial pressure drop to clear sky confirmation. I had the wind readings. I had the temperature curve. I had a small note to myself in the margin that said unusual cloud structure, low cohesion, possible mislabel. I brought it to Ardo. He was in the radar room, which is what we called the small annex where the main display was kept. He was drinking instant coffee out of a metal cup and watching the screen the way some people watch a fireplace. I showed him my log. I showed him the bulletin. I said, "The one on the 18th isn't listed." He looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked at the radar screen. Then he looked at me. "That one didn't get a name," he said. I waited for more. He drank his coffee. I said, "It was a pretty significant system." He said, "Sometimes they don't get names." That was all. He turned back to the screen, and I understood, without being told, that the conversation was over. I went back to my desk. I sat there for a while. Then I did something I hadn't done before. I took my log for the 18th, and I made a copy of it by hand, on a separate sheet, and I put that sheet in the back of my personal notebook. I'm not sure why. It felt like the kind of thing you do when you don't trust something but you don't yet know what. After that, I started watching. I watched the bulletins. I watched the logs. And over the next several weeks, I counted 4 more storms that I had personally observed and that never appeared in any official record. They weren't small. One of them dropped the temperature by 22 degrees in under an hour. One of them produced wind shear that bent the anemometer until Lisbeth had to go out and straighten it the next day. One of them made the radar do something I had never seen radar do, which was display a return that didn't move. It just sat there, in the southwest quadrant, for 40 minutes, and then it was gone, and the storm was gone with it. None of them got names. None of them got reports. They simply happened, and then they hadn't happened. I tried to bring it up once more, with Cohen, during one of the long quiet hours when the 2 of us were the only ones awake. We were in the kitchen module. He was eating something out of a can without really looking at it. I said, "Do you ever notice that some of the storms don't get logged?" He chewed for a while. Then he said, "Yeah." I said, "Why?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Have you asked?" He said, "I asked once." I waited. He didn't continue, so I asked what they told him. He said, "Havers told me that some things you log and some things you don't, and after a while you stop being able to tell the difference, so it's better not to start." He said it without any particular emphasis. Then he went back to his can. The conversation was over in the same way Ardo's had been, and I started to understand that this was how the station handled certain subjects. Not with secrecy exactly. With a kind of polite, exhausted refusal. The radio was where the next thing happened. Petrick ran the radio, but anyone could listen in, and during the long shifts I sometimes did. The traffic was mostly routine. Other stations checking in. Aircraft passing through our sector. Coast Guard on the high frequencies. Now and then, a fishing vessel out past the ice edge, which always made me think about how much darker their nights must have been than ours. But there were other transmissions. The first one I heard came on a frequency I didn't know we monitored. It was a voice reading numbers. Just numbers, in English, in a flat tone, with long pauses between them. I listened for about 10 minutes. The numbers didn't repeat in any pattern I could detect. The voice didn't change inflection. At one point, it stopped for almost a full minute, and I thought the transmission had ended, and then it started again, mid-sequence, as if no time had passed. I asked Patrick about it later. He was at his console, doing something with a soldering iron. I said, "There's a number station on one of our bands." He said, "Yes." I said, "Do we log it?" He said, "No." I said, "Should we?" He said, "No." He didn't look up from the soldering iron. I stood there for a moment. Then I said, "Do you know what it is?" He stopped soldering. He looked at me for the first time in the conversation. He had very pale eyes, and in the fluorescent light they looked almost colorless. He said, "When you hear it, write down the time. Don't write down the numbers. Just the time. Put it in the binder on the shelf. That's all." I asked which binder. He pointed without looking. I went to the shelf. There was a binder there with no label. I opened it. It was full of dates and times, in different handwritings, going back years. Some pages had been torn out. Some entries had been crossed out so thoroughly that the paper had torn. There was no key, no explanation, no header. Just times. I added the time of the transmission I had heard. I put the binder back. I went to my bunk and lay awake for a long time, listening to the generator, and to the wind, and to the buzzing of the lights, which now seemed to me to be saying something just below the threshold of comprehensibility. The first storm I lost time in came in late November, although the calendar by that point was more of a suggestion than a fact. It built fast. The pressure dropped through the floor of what I had thought was the floor. Lisbeth went out to secure the radar dome housing, and she came back inside with frost in her eyebrows and a look on her face that I didn't recognize. She didn't say anything. She just took off her outer layers and sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. Havers came through and said, "Procedure 4. Everyone moved. I didn't know what Procedure 4 was. Cohen grabbed my elbow as he passed and said, "Interior shutters. Then radio silence. Then we sit." I helped him close the interior shutters. They were heavy panels of insulated metal that fit over the inside of every window in the station. I had not previously known they existed. When they were closed, they latched in 3 places each, and the latches were the heavy kind, the kind designed to keep something out. Or in. We sat in the common module. All 6 of us. The lights were dimmed to their lowest setting. The radio was off. Havers had a watch on the table in front of him, and he watched the second hand the way a man watches a fuse. The storm hit. I have been in storms before. This was different. The wind didn't howl. It pressed. It pressed against the walls of the station in a steady, continuous way, like something was leaning on us. The whole structure flexed. I could feel the floor move under my feet, very slightly, in a slow rhythm. And then I heard the voice. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. It wasn't a voice that sounded like a person calling for help. It was a voice that sounded like a person who already knew my name, and was simply confirming it, from a distance, in a tone of mild recognition. It came from outside, somewhere past the east wall. It said something that might have been my name, or might have been a word that contained my name inside a larger word. I started to stand up. Cohen put his hand on my wrist. He didn't squeeze. He just rested his hand there. He didn't look at me. He was looking at Havers's watch. Nobody else reacted to the voice. I don't know if they didn't hear it, or if they had heard it before, or if hearing it was something you learn not to react to. I sat back down. The voice came again, further away this time, and then once more, very faint, and then it was gone, and there was only the pressing of the wind. We sat for 4 hours. When Havers finally stood up, the wind had eased, and he said, "Open them." And we opened the shutters, and the world outside was unchanged. Snow. Dark. The slow turning of the radar dome. I went to the radar log. The storm did not appear on the radar log. I checked the recording. The recording had no gap. The storm had not been recorded. I checked my watch against the clock on the wall. They disagreed by almost 40 minutes. I checked the clock against the station's main chronometer. The main chronometer disagreed with both of them by a different amount. I didn't say anything to anyone. I went to my bunk. I lay down. I tried to remember what the voice had said, and I found that I couldn't, exactly, although I knew it had said something, and I knew it had meant it for me. After that storm, I started to notice the small things. I noticed that Ardo sometimes spoke to the radar in a low voice, as if he were keeping it company. I noticed that Lisbeth kept a small object in her pocket, something she touched whenever she came inside from the cold, and that she would not let me see what it was. I noticed that the binder on Patrick's shelf grew thicker, although I never saw him add a page to it. I noticed that Havers slept in his clothes on the couch in the common module, with the door to his quarters closed, and that his quarters always smelled faintly of something I couldn't identify, something that was not bad but was not anything. I noticed that Cohen had a habit of counting under his breath. Always to 7. Then he would start over. I asked him about it once. He looked startled, the way someone looks when you catch them doing something they didn't know they were doing. He said, "It helps me know I'm still here." I asked what he meant. He said, "You'll see." I want to describe a thing that happened that I still don't have a complete memory of. It was in early December. There was a storm, but not a procedure for a storm. A normal one. I was on the 1100 ship, alone in the control room. I was logging surface temperatures. The temperature had been steady at -31 for almost 2 hours. I looked away from the instruments to write the number down. When I looked back, the temperature read -86. I stared at it. I tapped the gauge. The needle held. -86. I went to the second instrument, in the adjacent panel. -31. I went to the third instrument on the wall. -31. I went back to the first instrument. -31. I sat down. I sat for a long time. I didn't log either number. I didn't log anything, in fact, for the rest of that shift. When Ardo came in to relieve me, he looked at the empty log and didn't ask. He just nodded, very slightly, and sat down, and started writing in his own hand. When I went to bed that night, I noticed that my hands were shaking, and that they had probably been shaking for a while, and I had simply not been paying attention. I want to tell you about the hidden records, because I think that's the part that mattered most. I found them by accident. I was looking for spare ribbon for the teletype in a storage closet at the back of the communications module. The closet was small, and I had to move boxes to get to the supply shelf. Behind one of the boxes, on a low shelf, there was a stack of binders. They were not labeled, but they were old. The covers were the kind of pebbled gray that hasn't been manufactured in 30 years. I shouldn't have opened them. I did anyway. The first binder I opened was a log. It was a weather log, in handwriting I didn't recognize from a year before I was born. The entries were normal at first. Temperatures, pressures, wind. But interspersed with the normal entries, every few pages, there were entries written in a different style. Shorter. Stranger. They had no headers, no times, no instrumentation references. They were observations. One of them said, "The sound returned at the eastern fence line. 3 of us heard it. Bergen confirms it is the same as last season." One of them said, "Pressure anomaly in the southwest quadrant held for 91 minutes. Radar returned stationary. Do not transmit." One of them said, and I remember this one exactly because I read it 3 times, "The thing inside the storm has begun responding to the station." We do not know what this means. We have stopped using personal names on the open channel. I closed the binder. I put it back. I moved the boxes back into place. I stood in the closet with the door closed for what might have been a minute and might have been 10. Then I went out to the supply shelf, got the ribbon, and went back to the teletype, and I changed the ribbon, and I did not tell anyone what I had read. There is a thing that begins to happen to you, in a place like that, when you start to suspect that the institution you work for knows something it has decided not to share with you. It is not paranoia, exactly. Paranoia is sharper than what I am describing. It is more like a slow rearrangement of your trust. You stop trusting the bulletins. You stop trusting the schedule. You stop trusting your own memory, because your memory is the only instrument you have that hasn't been calibrated by someone else, and you have no way to know if it's accurate. You start to look at the people around you differently. Not with suspicion, with a kind of careful attention. You start to wonder what they know that they aren't telling you, and you start to wonder what they aren't telling themselves. I started watching Havas. He was the most opaque of all of them. He never spoke about anything personal. He had no photographs in his quarters, which I knew because I had once, briefly, looked. He didn't drink. He didn't read, except for the operational manuals, which he reread on a rotation I couldn't decipher. He was, as far as I could tell, made entirely of the station. One night, I came into the common module to get water, and he was sitting at the table with the lights off. He was just sitting. I started to apologize for interrupting him, and he said, without turning around, "Did you hear it tonight?" I said, "Hear what?" He said, "If you have to ask, you didn't." He didn't say anything else. I got my water and left. The storm I want to tell you about, the one that I think was the storm, came in the middle of December. It built differently from the others. It didn't come from the west, the way most of our weather did. It came from the north, from the part of the map where there isn't supposed to be much that generates weather, and it came slowly, over almost 2 days, like it was deciding. Ardo saw it first. He called Havas into the radar room. They stood there for a long time, looking at the screen, and then Havas went to the radio room and closed the door, and he was in there for almost an hour, and when he came out his face was the same as it always was, but he moved differently. Slower. More deliberately. The way you move when you are trying not to startle something. He called us all into the common module. He said, "There is a system approaching from the north. We are going to run a full lockdown. Procedure 6. Nobody asked what Procedure 6 was. Cohen looked at me, very briefly, and I understood that I was about to find out. Procedure 6 meant the interior shutters, and the radio silence, and the dimmed lights, but it also meant other things. We sealed the doors between the modules with a heavy gasket material that Lisbeth pulled from a locker I had not known about. We turned off the generator. The generator. The thing that had been the constant background of every moment of my life on the station was shut down, manually, by Havers, and we switched to a small battery system that ran only the most essential instruments. The station went almost silent. I could hear my own pulse. We sat. Havers had his watch on the table. He looked at it for a long time, but he didn't seem to be looking at the time. He was looking at it the way you look at something that gives you comfort. The storm took 6 hours to arrive. We could feel it before we could hear it. The pressure changed in the room. My ears popped twice. Lisbeth's nose started to bleed, very slowly, and she just sat there with a folded cloth pressed against it, not reacting. When the storm hit, it didn't sound like wind. This is the part one had the most trouble describing. The wind was there. I could feel it on the walls. But the sound that came through the walls was not the sound of wind. It was layered. There was wind, yes, and there was the scraping of snow against the building, but underneath those things, there was another sound. A low one. A continuous one. It was the sound something very large makes when it is breathing slowly, and it was not coming from any one direction. It was coming from all of them. I looked at Havas. He was looking at his watch. I looked at Cohen. He was counting under his breath. To 7. Then starting over. I looked at Ardo. He had his eyes closed. His lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. I looked at Patrick. He was looking directly at me. He held my eyes for a long moment. Then, very slightly, he shook his head. Just once. I understood that he was telling me not to speak, and not to move, and not to react to anything I heard, no matter what it was. I heard my name. I heard my name 3 times, at 3 different distances, in 3 different voices, and one of the voices was my mother's, and one was a voice I had never heard before, and one was my own. I did not move. I did not speak. I counted, in my head, to 7, and then I started over. The storm lasted 9 hours. When it ended, it didn't end the way a storm ends. It withdrew. That is the only word I have for it. The pressure normalized. The sound that wasn't wind faded, not all at once, but in stages, like something was walking away. Havers stood up. He went to the door of the module and put his hand against it. He stood there for several minutes. Then he nodded, and Lisbeth got up and broke the seal on the door, and we opened the shutters, and the world outside was as it had always been. The radar log was blank for the period of the storm. The teletype had not received any traffic for the period of the storm. Patrick's binder, when I checked it later, had 3 new entries in it, in his handwriting, although I had not seen him write anything during the lockdown. I went outside, just once, that morning, because I needed to. I needed to see whatever there was to see. I bundled up and I went out the side door, and I stood in the snow for maybe a minute. There were no tracks. I want to make that clear. There were no tracks of anything around the station. The snow was smooth in every direction. But the radar dome was facing north. It is supposed to rotate continuously. It always rotates continuously. I had heard it rotating for months. It had never stopped before, and it has never stopped since. That morning, it was pointed north, and it was still. I stood there until my face started to hurt, and then I went back inside, and I did not mention the dome to anyone, and the next time I looked at it, an hour later, it was rotating again, and I cannot tell you whether anyone went out to start it, or whether it started on its own. A few days after that storm, Cohen broke. That is the word I want to use, although it is not entirely fair to him. He didn't have a dramatic episode. He didn't shout or weep or do anything that would look like a crisis from the outside. What happened was that he stopped counting. I noticed it during a meal. He was eating, and his lips weren't moving, and there was a stillness in him that I had not seen before. I asked him if he was all right. He looked at me, and he smiled, in a slow, friendly way, and he said, "I don't have to anymore." I said, "Don't have to what?" He said, "I don't have to know I'm still here. I'm fine with not knowing." He went back to eating. He seemed peaceful. He seemed, in fact, more peaceful than I had ever seen him. And that was the thing that frightened me, because I understood, looking at him, that whatever procedure he had been running in his head, all those months, that had been the thing keeping him intact, and now he had let it go, and what was left looked like Cohen but moved through the station the way you move through a place you have already left. A supply plane came 2 weeks later, and Cohen left on it. Havers arranged it. Nobody discussed it. He packed his things and he stood on the strip with his bag and he waved at me, once, before he got on the plane, and the wave was the wave of someone who didn't quite remember who he was waving at but was being polite about it. Lisbeth replaced him in the rotation. She didn't comment. None of us did. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Havers near the end of my contract, because I think it is the closest thing to an explanation that I ever received, and it was not an explanation. It was late. I was in the common module, drinking tea that had gone cold without my noticing. Havers came in and sat down across from me. He didn't bring anything to drink. He just sat. He said, "You've been here long enough to start asking." I said, "Asking what?" He said, "Whatever it is you've been not asking." I thought about it for a while. There were many things I had not asked. I picked one. I said, "What is in the storms?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know." I said, "Does anyone know?" He said, Some people think they do. I've read what they think. I don't believe most of it. The honest answer is that there is something that uses certain storms the way you and I use a hallway. It moves through them. It has been doing this for a long time. Longer than the station. Longer than the records the station replaced. We log the storms it doesn't use. We don't log the storms it does. That is the arrangement. I said. Whose arrangement? He said. I don't know that either. I inherited it. The man before me inherited it. He told me what he was told, and I'm telling you what I was told, and someday you'll tell someone else, if you stay, and that is how it continues. I said. Why don't we report it? He looked at his hands. He said. We tried a long time ago. I wasn't here then. The people who were here then are not here anymore. The reports were not believed, and the people who made them were moved to other postings, and the postings were not good, and after a while, the reports stopped, and the station learned to do what it does. We are not hiding it from anyone who is looking. We are simply not making it easier to find. I said. What does it want? He said. I don't think it wants anything. I don't think it knows we're here. I think we are something it passes near. The voices in the storm are not, in my opinion, the voices of it. I think they are echoes of things it has been near before. I think when it passes near you, it leaves some of those echoes behind, and you carry them with you, and that is the part you have to learn to live with. He stood up. He said. You can leave on the next supply plane if you want. You've done well. You can also stay. Either is acceptable. I will not try to convince you of either one. He went to his quarters. I sat in the common module for a long time, with the cold tea, and I listened to the generator, and the buzzing of the lights, and the slow turning of the radar dome, which I could not actually hear from inside but which I had begun, by then, to hear anyway. I stayed for another 4 months. I don't have a good reason for it. I tell myself I stayed because I needed the money. That is partly true. I tell myself I stayed because I wanted to understand. That is also partly true, although by then I had accepted that I would not understand, and that the staying was not about understanding. I think, honestly, I stayed because I had begun to feel that leaving would not return me to a world that was any more noble than the one I was in. I had begun to suspect that the world I had come from was also full of storms that didn't get names, and that I had simply never noticed. There were more storms during those 4 months. 3 of them were Procedure 4. One was Procedure 6. I do not remember the Procedure 6 one as well as I should. There is a period of about 11 hours, during that storm, that I cannot account for. I have my log, in my own handwriting, covering that period, and the entries are normal, and they are in my hand, but I do not remember writing them, and there are small things in them, turns of phrase, an abbreviation I do not use, that do not feel like mine. I asked Patrick, once, what he thought happened during the gaps. He was at his console. He didn't look up. He said, "You did your job. That's all that matters." I said, "But I don't remember doing it." He said, "That's also part of the job." When I finally left, in the spring, although spring is the wrong word for what passes for spring up there, the supply plane that took me out was flown by a different pilot than the one who had brought me in. He was younger. He tried to make conversation. He asked me how the posting had been. I told him it had been quiet. He nodded. He said, "I hear that station gets some weird weather." I said, "Does it?" He looked at me, briefly, and then he looked back at the controls, and he didn't bring it up again. I watched the station disappear behind us. The radar dome turning. The cluster of low buildings sinking back into the snow. I tried to feel something about leaving. I couldn't, particularly. I felt the way you feel when you finish a task that took longer than expected, and you can't quite remember what you were doing before you started it. I have been back in the lower 48 for almost a year now. I live in a small apartment in a small city. I work an office job that has nothing to do with weather. I sleep well most nights. I do not consider myself traumatized. I do not consider myself, particularly, anything. But there are a few things I have noticed, and I want to mention them, because I think they are the point of telling you any of this. I have noticed that I still count to 7, sometimes, when I am alone, although I did not pick the habit up consciously and I do not know when I started. I have noticed that I check the weather every morning on 3 different services, and that I cross-reference them, and that I am looking for something specific, although I could not tell you what. I have noticed that there are storms, occasionally, that the services disagree about. One service will report a system. Another will not. I make a note of these in a small book I keep, and I do not show the book to anyone, and I am not sure why I keep it, except that I have come to believe, in a quiet way, that the arrangement Havers described to me is not limited to one station in northern Alaska. I think it is a larger arrangement. I think it is in many places. I think there are people in many small offices, in many small buildings, who have been told the same thing I was told, and who are doing the same thing I did, and who carry the same echoes I carry, and who, like me, do not bring it up. I have noticed that I sometimes hear my name, very faintly, when there is wind against the windows of my apartment. I do not turn toward the sound. I have learned not to. I have noticed that when I dream, which is not often, I dream of the radar dome, and it is always pointing north, and it is always still, and the snow around it is always smooth, and I always understand, in the dream, that something has just passed, and that it will pass again, and that the station will be there to not record it, and that this is, in some way I cannot quite articulate, a comfort. I do not know what was in those storms. I do not know if Havers was right that it didn't know we were there. I do not know if Cohen is well, or if he is somewhere, smiling peacefully at a wall, no longer needing to count. I know that the station is still operating. I checked, a few months ago, through channels I should probably not have used. The roster has changed. There are new names. Havers is still there. Petrick is still there. Ardo is not, although his name has not been replaced. There is just a blank line where his name used to be, and I do not know what to make of that, and I have decided not to ask. The storms, presumably, continue. The bulletins continue. The number station, on the frequency we did not officially monitor, continues, I assume, to read its numbers into the dark, and someone, in that small back room, continues to write down the times without the numbers, in a binder with no label. And somewhere, in the north, a radar dome turns and turns and turns, and occasionally, for reasons no one will write down, it stops, and faces a direction it has chosen, and waits. I think about that sometimes, when I cannot sleep. I think about the dome, and the smooth snow, and the voice that said my name from 3 different distances. I think about Havers's watch on the table, and the way he looked at it, and how I understand now that he was not checking the time. He was simply giving his eyes something to do, so they would not wander toward the walls, and toward whatever was on the other side of them, leaning. And then I count to 7, and I start over,